Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. On a damp spring morning in London, Adrian Burke sat alone in his tiny third-floor flat, cradling a lukewarm cup of coffee while staring blankly at the screen of his laptop. The email subject line was simple: position accepted, Meadowridge School. After weeks of searching for a steady job, Adrian had finally landed an opportunity to teach again, a lead teaching position at a primary school located far up north, in a remote village named Meadowridge that barely showed up on maps. What caught Adrian's attention wasn't just the secluded location, but the oddly fast hiring process. No interviews, no follow-up calls. He had only submitted his resume and a short motivation letter. Within days, an official offer had been emailed back to him. It was as though the school had been waiting specifically for him. Something about it felt a little too convenient, yet the desperation to work again overshadowed any lingering doubts. That same day, Adrian began packing. He ended his lease, sold off what little furniture he owned, and prepared himself for a new beginning. There were no friends waiting for him there, no acquaintances, and no clear image of what the village even looked like. All he knew was that he'd be teaching young children, and maybe, just maybe, finding peace in a simpler life. But what he didn't know was that this move to Meadowridge would be the beginning of a series of events that no logic could ever fully explain. The journey to Meadowridge took over 5 hours by train, followed by another hour on a local bus that only ran twice a day. When Adrian stepped off the bus at the village's tiny roadside stop, the first thing he noticed was the cold. Not a breeze or a mild chill, but a biting drop in temperature that didn't make sense. According to the forecast on his phone, the day was meant to be warm and sunny. But here, it felt more like late autumn than mid-June. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight that settled on his shoulders as he began walking the narrow gravel path into the village. Gnarled trees lined the roadside, casting long shadows even though it was barely noon. Black birds, ravens, perhaps, sat eerily still on telephone wires overhead, not making a sound. The buildings he passed were ancient stone houses with crooked chimneys and sagging rooftops. There wasn't a soul in sight. As he made his way toward the inn that had been arranged by the school, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that the village itself was observing him. Not the people, but the land. The trees. The wind. Everything felt too still, too quiet, like a place preserved in time, or waiting. There was something deeply unsettling about Meadowridge, and he hadn't even stepped into the school yet. Passing through the center of Meadowridge, Adrian began to notice subtle movements behind lace curtains and dusty windowpanes. The village seemed abandoned at first glance, but behind every house, there were eyes, watching. Curtains shifted slightly as he walked by. A pair of eyes here, a silhouette there. Not a single smile or friendly wave greeted him. No one stepped forward to ask if he needed directions. Just cold, quiet observation. The few villagers he did see outside stood silently by their gates, dressed in dark, outdated clothing, their faces pale and unreadable. One elderly man leaned on a carved walking stick, staring at Adrian with a gaze that never blinked. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. Judgment. Perhaps even, recognition. Adrian felt like a stranger in a place where strangers weren't welcome. And yet, the way they watched him, closely, intently, made it feel like they had been expecting him. It was a gaze not of surprise, but of silent apprehension. As if his presence disrupted something delicate. Something the village had tried to bury. The inn was a modest 2-story structure on the edge of the village, once a family farmhouse now converted into a handful of rooms for the rare traveler. The woman who owned it was middle-aged, dressed plainly, and moved with slow, precise gestures. Her eyes were sunken and her voice barely above a whisper. She showed Adrian to his room with a dull expression, offering no warm welcome, no pleasantries. When Adrian casually brought up the school, asking about directions or the history of the place, her demeanor changed. She paused for a moment, fingers clutching the doorframe, and said nothing. Her silence was loud. Her face went blank, and her eyes drifted toward the curtained window, as if recalling something she'd rather forget. Eventually, in a voice that felt more like a warning than advice, she muttered that Meadowridge was quiet for a reason. That the people here knew better than to ask questions. And the school, she insisted, was not a place to dwell on. Especially not for someone new. With that, she handed him the room key and disappeared down the hall without looking back. Adrian was left standing there, holding a brass key that felt oddly cold in his hand. The shadows in the room had grown longer. And out his window, barely visible through the fog, stood the silhouette of the school building, waiting. The next morning, Adrian set out early, the steam from his cup of tea rising into the cold air as he walked toward the school. The village remained eerily quiet. No chatter, no children, just the crunch of gravel beneath his boots and the occasional rustle of wind. Then, through the thinning mist, the school revealed itself. It stood like a forgotten relic, tall, crooked, and weathered by decades of rain and rot. The white paint on the exterior walls had all but peeled away, revealing the stone bones beneath. Its windows were large and covered in grime, their glass cracked in several places. A rusted iron gate guarded the entrance, creaking loudly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and damp timber. The old wooden floors groaned under his steps. Hallways were lined with photographs of former classes, their frames crooked, the images faded. Several photos had faces that were scratched out or missing entirely. As Adrian approached the main classroom, something caught his eye. Written faintly in chalk across the blackboard was a single word. Not a lesson. Not a greeting. Just one word, scrawled in uneven strokes as if left in a rush, or a warning, stay. Adrian began his first day at Meadowridge School with cautious optimism. Despite the condition of the building, the classroom had been cleaned just enough to be usable. Desks were neatly arranged, supplies were in place, and a fresh box of chalk sat on his desk, though he couldn't recall anyone mentioning where it had come from. Still, he tried to keep his mind focused on the students. But as the children began filing in, something felt undeniably wrong. There were 12 of them. All appeared healthy, dressed in uniform, but they moved with an eerie stillness. They didn't chat among themselves. No whispers, no laughter. They sat down quietly, their faces pale, expressions blank, eyes never meeting his or each other's. When Adrian greeted them, only a few nodded stiffly. The rest just stared. Their silence wasn't out of shyness, it felt rehearsed. They obeyed every instruction without resistance, but never once asked a question. When Adrian turned to write on the chalkboard, he could feel their eyes boring into his back. When he tried to tell a joke or lighten the mood, they gave no reaction. And every so often, one of them would glance, ever so slightly, toward the back of the room. Not at him. Not at a classmate. But at an empty corner where nothing stood but shadow. By the end of the day, Adrian's nerves were rattled. He had never seen children behave like that. It was as if they were scared to speak, or worse, forbidden to. And the way they kept glancing at that one spot in the classroom, it gave the unsettling impression that they weren't the only ones in the room. While tidying up after the last bell, Adrian noticed a small, leather-bound notebook left behind on one of the desks. He assumed it belonged to one of the quieter students, Thomas, perhaps, or Elsie, but no name was written on the cover. Curious, he flipped it open. The first few pages were typical, handwriting practice, simple spelling exercises. But further in, the content changed dramatically. The neat lines gave way to chaotic scribbles. Heavy pencil marks scratched deep into the paper, forming unsettling images. Page after page showed the same figure, a woman in a long dress, standing in corners, behind trees, or at the end of hallways. Always far from the viewer. Always watching. Her face, however, was never drawn. Where her face should have been was either left blank or scribbled out violently. In some drawings, black circles represented eyes, wide, hollow, bleeding ink. In others, the mouth was drawn open impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. The margins of the pages were filled with phrases written repeatedly: "She waits. She listens. Don't turn around." And most disturbingly, one page simply read, "She comes when you teach alone." Adrian felt a sudden wave of nausea. He slammed the notebook shut and shoved it into a drawer, telling himself it was just the imagination of a troubled child. But deep down, he knew what he saw had weight, an echo of something real. Something hiding just beneath the surface of this quiet, unnatural school. After a week at the school, Adrian began staying later than usual, hoping to get a better handle on the lesson plans and familiarize himself with the students' files. The village had no internet, and the school's records were entirely handwritten, stacked in dusty filing cabinets in the back office. Most evenings, he was the last one to leave. One night, long after the sun had disappeared behind the forested hills, Adrian sat alone in the teacher's office, surrounded by old paper and flickering lamplight. The silence of the building was deafening, until it wasn't. It started with a soft creak, like floorboards under shifting weight. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallway just outside his door. He froze. His mind raced for logical explanations, perhaps the custodian, a wandering student, but he knew the school was empty. He had checked. Twice. The steps grew louder. Closer. They stopped directly outside the door. Adrian held his breath. No knock. No voice. Just silence. After several long moments, he mustered the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, the floor dusty with undisturbed footprints, except for one. A single, smeared print just in front of the door. Not made by a shoe, but a bare foot. Small. Slender. Like that of a woman. He shut the door and didn't return to that hallway for the rest of the night. In the days that followed, Adrian became increasingly uneasy within the school. The children's behavior had grown stranger, and the cold inside the building never seemed to lift. The heating system, though ancient, was functional, but the chill persisted, particularly in the lower halls. While exploring the basement level, where old supplies were stored, Adrian noticed a heavy wooden door at the far end of the corridor. A faded sign hung crookedly on its surface, "Staff only." The odd part was, he had never seen any other staff since his arrival. No other teachers, no janitor, no headmaster. No one had ever come to check on him, and none of the students spoke of any other adults in the building. The door was locked, and when Adrian tried the handle, it didn't budge. He peered through the small wired window, but the glass was too clouded with dust and age to see through. Still, he sensed something behind it, a presence, a weight in the air. Later, when he asked the innkeeper about the staff room, her only response was to change the subject. And the next day, he noticed the "Staff only" sign had been freshly nailed into place, as if someone wanted to ensure it stayed closed. He hadn't told anyone he'd seen it. That night, he dreamed of the door. But in the dream, it wasn't locked. And something was waiting on the other side. The final straw of Adrian's first 10 days at Meadowridge came in the form of markings. He arrived early one morning, as he always did, and immediately noticed something different. The classroom was darker than usual, despite the windows being open. The air felt thick, humid, and the scent of old wood had been replaced by something more, metallic. As he walked toward the blackboard, his eyes caught it: drawings. Symbols. Etched into the wood paneling along the back wall. Dozens of them. Circles within circles, jagged lines, spirals and arrows, all carved deeply as if by a knife. They weren't there the day before. The markings pulsed with a kind of wrongness. They felt old, older than the school itself, and filled with purpose. Adrian ran his fingers over one of the carvings. It was fresh. The edges still sharp. Beneath one of the symbols, written in a child's handwriting, were the words, "She teaches too." Adrian turned to look at the class photo wall. Every frame was tilted. Every picture had fallen. The faces of the students in every image, scratched out. And at the far end of the room, in the same corner the children always glanced at, the shadows seemed darker than ever. Denser. Almost, watching. After discovering the strange symbols in the classroom, Adrian tried to convince himself they were a prank, children acting out, carving things for attention. But as the days dragged on, he began noticing things that no rational explanation could justify. The children were watching him. Not openly, not all at once, but always watching. If he turned his back, he'd feel their eyes on him. When he turned around, most would quickly look away, pretending to work, yet there was always one, just one, that kept looking. What disturbed him more was their behavior when he asked about the symbols. He brought it up casually during a lesson, pretending to be curious rather than concerned. The moment he mentioned the markings, the classroom went completely silent. The children stiffened. A few flinched. One girl at the back began quietly sobbing, her face buried in her hands. Adrian stopped talking immediately. No one would meet his gaze for the rest of the day. That night, as he reviewed student files in his room above the inn, he noticed something chilling. 4 of the names on his roster, students who sat in his class every single day, did not appear in any of the school records. Not as current students. Not even in past class lists. It was as if they had never been enrolled. Yet, he had seen them. Heard them. Marked their attendance. He began to wonder, were they even real? Adrian awoke one morning to find a small envelope slid under his door. It had no name, no address, just the words "Leave now" scrawled in thick black ink. Inside was a single piece of yellowed paper. No greeting. No signature. Just a message written in hurried, jagged handwriting. You don't belong here. The children aren't safe. She remembers what the last teacher did. You must leave before she chooses you too. The word "chooses" had been underlined 3 times. The rest of the note was stained with what looked like old watermarks, or maybe tears. Adrian stared at the letter for a long time. Was it a cruel joke? A warning? A desperate plea? He thought of asking the innkeeper, but something told him she would deny everything. There was a pattern forming, whispers in the dark, truths left unsaid. Someone had tried to speak. Someone had broken the silence. That meant not everyone in the village was blind to what was happening. But it also meant that someone was watching him closely enough to deliver this without being seen. The staff hallway was a narrow corridor behind the library, lined with cracked plaster and framed portraits of former faculty. Adrian had walked by the wall dozens of times without paying attention. But today, something drew his eyes to the middle row, perhaps a subconscious tug, or maybe something darker. The photos were old, many in black and white, all showing proud teachers standing in front of the building, smiling, arms folded, unaware of what the future held. Then he saw it. The third frame from the left. A woman in a long dress stood beside 2 children. Her posture was rigid, hands clasped tightly in front of her. But her face had been scratched out violently. Not digitally. Not blurred. Someone had taken a knife or sharp object to the photograph itself. Dozens of scratches rendered her features unrecognizable, replaced with a jagged, angry hole. No name plaque. No date. Only the empty frame below. He leaned closer. On the photo's glass, from the inside, something had been etched into the surface. It wasn't visible at first, but under the light, it caught his eye. 4 words. She never really left. Driven by obsession or dread, maybe both, Adrian returned to the locked basement door. He searched the school until he found a rusted key hidden behind a false panel in a cabinet labeled "Staff Supplies." How long had it been there? He wasn't sure. But he felt compelled to take it. That evening, when the children had left and silence had taken over, he returned to the door. The key fit. The lock clicked. Inside was a narrow, dust-choked room filled with decaying furniture, broken chairs, and long-forgotten teaching materials. But in the far corner, half buried beneath a moth-eaten shawl, he found a leather-bound book. A diary. Its first page was labeled with a name, Margaret Linton. He flipped through the pages. At first, it was filled with mundane details, lesson plans, observations about her students. But by the middle of the diary, her entries took a dark turn. They won't speak to me anymore. I hear her in the walls at night. The children know. They see her too. I tried to leave. The road vanished. The final entry simply read. She doesn't like when I teach her name. That night, Adrian packed a bag. He didn't even leave a note. He had no solid plan, just one goal, leave Meadowridge and never return. The diary had shaken him. The warnings were no longer subtle. Something had happened to Margaret Linton. Something real. And if he stayed, the same fate would likely claim him. He got into the borrowed bicycle provided by the inn and rode toward the main road, the only road that led in or out of the village. But after nearly an hour of pedaling, he realized something was wrong. The path, once familiar, began to twist unnaturally. Trees on either side grew denser, closer, as if trying to pull together and trap him. Fog rolled in unnaturally fast, swallowing the road behind him. His surroundings blurred, the landscape repeating itself again and again. Eventually, he came to a clearing he had passed 30 minutes earlier. Same bent tree. Same fallen signpost. Same broken fence. He was riding in circles. He dropped the bike and stood there, heart pounding. The village would not let him leave. And deep in the silence, he thought he heard a whisper on the wind. A woman's voice. Calling his name. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it felt less like rest and more like submission, like the mind surrendering to something watching from the darkness. Adrian found himself standing in the same staff hallway, surrounded by the old portraits. But this time, the scratched-out woman was not faceless. In the dream, her features slowly returned, piece by piece, like flesh regrowing over bone. Her eyes were the first to appear, pale, almost colorless, and impossibly wide. Her mouth came last. It didn't smile. It stretched. She stepped out of the photograph. No sound. No footsteps. Her movements were sudden, like the skipping frames of a broken film reel. She moved toward him, each step silent, jarring, unnatural. Behind her, the children stood in rows, their faces emotionless. Eyes glassy. Lips stitched shut with black thread. As she reached out her hand, Adrian screamed. He woke up drenched in sweat. His throat sore, his chest heavy. The air in the room was freezing. He looked at the window, closed. He looked at the door, still locked. But on the mirror, written in condensation, were 5 chilling words. You taught her name too. The following day, Adrian tried to maintain control. He resumed teaching as if nothing had happened. The children sat silently, obedient as always. But something in their expressions had shifted, subtle, but real. Their eyes no longer just watched him. They studied him. Measured him. Then, it happened. During a reading lesson, a small boy, Thomas, stood up abruptly. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, his eyes rolling back. His lips moved, forming shapes, but no sound came out. Then, as if a switch flipped, he screamed a single syllable, something not in any language Adrian recognized. Then he collapsed. The room erupted in chaos. Children cried. Chairs scraped the floor. Adrian rushed to the boy, but his body was ice cold. For a few seconds, Adrian was convinced Thomas had died right there in front of him. But then the boy gasped. His eyes snapped open. And the first thing he did was stare directly at Adrian and whisper, "She knows now." Shaken by the collapse, Adrian went straight to the headmistress's office. Mrs. Weatherby had always been cold and distant, but today, she looked different. Older somehow. More brittle. Her hands trembled as she offered him tea he didn't drink. He told her everything, the symbols, the strange behavior, the diary, the letter under his door. He even mentioned Margaret Linton. She didn't interrupt. She didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the fireplace, where no fire burned. When he finished, she slowly turned to him and said only one sentence. "If you value your life, you will stop asking about her." Then she stood and opened the door, signaling their conversation was over. Before Adrian left, he glanced at the framed photograph on her desk. It showed a much younger Mrs. Weatherby, standing in front of the school alongside another woman. The other woman was Margaret Linton. The school had started to feel like a labyrinth, each hallway containing more secrets than answers. But Adrian couldn't stop now. Something pushed him forward, an invisible force, as if the school itself wanted its story told. One late evening, as he erased the chalkboard in room 6, the one where Thomas collapsed, his hand caught the edge of something unnatural. A seam. He tapped on it. Hollow. He pushed. The board shifted with a heavy creak, revealing a narrow passageway behind it. Dust poured out, filling the air with the smell of rot and paper. Adrian took his phone out for light and stepped inside. It was a storage space, but not for books or supplies. It was filled with dozens of tiny desks, all facing one direction. At the front, a child-sized mannequin sat slumped in a chair, dressed in an old uniform. Its head had been removed. On the walls, drawings. Dozens. All made by children. All showing the same thing, a tall, faceless woman standing beside a bleeding blackboard. One drawing stood out. It was signed, Margaret. At the very back of the hidden room, tucked inside a warped filing cabinet, Adrian found a folder labeled, Class of 1956. Inside was a single photo. He recognized the building, it was the same school, only decades earlier. The children looked normal. Some even smiled. At the center stood the teacher, Margaret Linton, her arms protectively folded. But as Adrian stared at the image, the faces began to change. It wasn't an illusion or paranoia. The children's faces slowly warped on the page, their smiles curving downward. Eyes darkening. Their expressions filled with terror. One by one, the children began looking behind them, in the photo. Behind Margaret. There, at the edge of the image, was a shape. Tall. Shadowy. Featureless. As Adrian watched, the photograph curled in his hand as if recoiling from what it held. The air turned heavy, and from somewhere deep in the walls of the school, a low groan echoed, like a warning. Or a welcome. From that night forward, Adrian noticed something subtle yet unnerving. The lights in the main corridor would always dim slightly when he passed by the old, unused staff room at the east end of the school. At first, he told himself it was nothing, just faulty wiring in an ancient building. But it kept happening. Every time. Always the same spot. Always the same delay. One afternoon, he tested it, walking back and forth, watching as the lights above him flickered out the moment his foot crossed an invisible threshold. When he stepped back, they returned. Like the building was breathing around him. He stood still in front of the old staff room door. The glass panel was clouded with age, but he could just barely make out the outline of a table inside. Then something moved. Quick. Just a blur. But enough to make his heart skip. He reached for the handle. It was ice cold. In the days that followed, Adrian grew more obsessed. He began inspecting every detail in his classroom, walls, floors, furniture, searching for more signs. What he found chilled him to the bone. Under the desks, each and every one, was a name. Not a student's name. Not the school's. Margaret. Carved in different hands. Some shaky, like from a frightened child. Some etched deep, angrily, repeatedly. He found the name on the legs of chairs, behind coat hooks, and even inside textbooks, always scratched in, never printed. It was as if the children had been made to remember her. Or worse, forced to. He took photos, documented each one. But when he checked his phone later that night, the images were gone. Every single one. Replaced with a black screen. And in the middle of the blackness, a word began to form, faint, white, and pulsing like a warning. Listen. Desperate for answers, Adrian tracked down someone who might remember, Walter Griggs, the school's former janitor who had retired over 30 years earlier. He found him at a nursing home outside the village, barely lucid, eyes clouded from age or trauma. When Adrian mentioned the school, the man's demeanor changed. His hands trembled. He whispered that the building was never meant to be reopened. Then he told a story, haltingly, as if every word cost him a piece of his sanity. In 1956, a new teacher named Margaret Linton had joined the faculty. She was brilliant, kind, and deeply devoted to her students. But one day, after a series of increasingly erratic behaviors, she locked herself and her entire class inside room 6. They were found 2 days later. The students were alive. Margaret was not. She had taken her own life at the front of the room, her body discovered slumped across a desk, her fingernails embedded in the wood as if she had tried to claw her way back from something. The janitor's voice dropped to a whisper. She didn't die angry. She died betrayed. Haunted by the janitor's words, Adrian returned to room 6 late that evening. The halls were quiet, shadows pooling in the corners like ink. No students, no staff. Just him, the old building, and the secrets it was finally starting to unveil. The desks were as he left them. Except one. It was the teacher's desk, the original oak one that had been there since the school's founding. On its surface, Adrian saw a faint discoloration. A stain, long since wiped clean but still visible under certain light. He brought a flashlight closer. It wasn't ink. It was blood. And as he traced his hand along the edge, he felt something strange beneath the surface. He knelt down and found deep gouges carved underneath, desperate, jagged claw marks. As if someone had tried to hold on. Or escape. Suddenly, the classroom door slammed shut behind him. And the whispering began. At first, it was faint, like wind slipping through a crack. But it grew louder, layered, like dozens of voices pressed against the walls. Children's voices. They weren't speaking words. They were chanting. Margaret. 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 Over and over. The lights flickered violently. The windows fogged over. Adrian backed away from the desk, his breath turning visible. He tried the door. It wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the outside, or maybe from within. The chanting rose in pitch, turning shrill, nearly unbearable. And just when it reached its crescendo, everything stopped. Silence. Then a single voice, clear, cold, feminine, whispered directly behind his ear. You brought her back. Adrian spun around. No one was there. But on the blackboard, written in fresh chalk that he hadn't touched, was a date. October 13, 1956. And beneath it. Class dismissed. After that chilling night in room 6, Adrian couldn't sleep. The name, the voices, the date, it looped in his mind like a fever dream. He searched every archive he could access, digging through school records, local newspapers, even old hospital admissions. At first, he found nothing. Then, in an obscure regional newspaper, he found it. October 13, 1956. The day St. Ethel's Academy was temporarily shut down due to what officials called a mass hysteria event. Reports stated that 21 students were hospitalized, found screaming uncontrollably, scratching at their own skin, their eyes unfocused and mouths babbling the same name. Margaret. The incident had been dismissed, hushed, and forgotten. No charges filed. No full investigation. Just a tragic teacher's suicide and some traumatized children. But there were holes in the official story. Why had the school reopened without structural changes? Why were the records of Margaret Linton's employment redacted? Why did the community act like she had never existed? The terror wasn't confined to school anymore. Adrian started hearing footsteps in his flat, slow, pacing, dragging footsteps. At first, only at night. Then in the early mornings. Then in broad daylight. The mirrors in his home fogged without reason. His kettle would switch on by itself. Sometimes, while grading papers, he would glance up and see a shadow in the corner of his vision, a female figure standing just out of sight. The worst was the piano. He didn't own a piano. Yet at 3:03 a.m., every night for 5 consecutive nights, the sound of old keys playing a single note echoed through his flat. G sharp. Low. Hollow. Relentless. On the 6th night, it played 3 notes. And the walls started to bleed. Back at school, Adrian noticed a loose panel behind the coat closet in room 6. Driven by obsession and fear, he pried it open. Inside was a moldy, water-damaged notebook, its cover torn, its pages curled with age. A student's diary. The entries were dated the months leading up to October 1956. The handwriting was erratic, the tone unhinged. The student, only identified by the initial CA, described dreams of a woman standing in the rain outside the classroom window. Dreams that bled into waking hours. He wrote about how Margaret would stand silently at the blackboard for hours, not speaking. About how she started locking the classroom door from the inside. How she made the students chant things they didn't understand. But the final entry was the most disturbing. It read, "We are not her students. We are her sacrifice." Adrian approached Principal Donnelly the next morning, diary in hand, hands trembling. He demanded an explanation, about the diary, the name Margaret, the date October 13th. Donnelly barely glanced at the notebook before shoving it back at him. His voice was cold, rehearsed. "There was no teacher named Margaret Linton. You're overworked. Take the week off." But Adrian saw it. The flicker of recognition in the principal's eyes. The way his hands trembled when he said her name. Before Adrian left the office, he noticed an old photograph hanging on the wall. It was a group shot of faculty from 1955. A dozen teachers in neat black and white rows. And there she was. The third woman from the left. Standing stiff. Wearing a dark dress. Margaret. But someone had taken a pen and scratched out her eyes. That night, the dream returned. But this time it wasn't silent. He was seated in room 6, at one of the small desks, surrounded by children with blank faces and hollow eyes. Their mouths moved in unison, chanting words in a language he didn't recognize. On the blackboard, lines appeared in chalk, over and over, the same phrase. "Bring her back. Bring her back." Adrian couldn't move. He felt paralyzed. As if something else was using his body. His hands joined the chant. His mouth moved without his control. Then the classroom door opened slowly. And Margaret stepped in. But her body was wrong, twisted, unnatural, as though every bone had been broken and reset at wrong angles. Her head tilted too far. Her eyes were hollow voids. And yet she smiled. She reached out for him. And the lights went out. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum inside a coffin. The dream, if it was one, still lingered in fragments. Chanting. The children. Margaret's broken smile. Trying to shake it off, he sat at the edge of his bed, clutching his head. Then he noticed it. Chalk dust. Under his fingernails. On his palms. On his pillow. And his apartment didn't have a blackboard. Nor chalk. Dread twisted in his gut as he rose and walked into the hallway. On the living room wall, clear as day, was a message written in crooked, looping white. You belong in room 6. The following day, Adrian went where no staff were allowed without authorization, the school's basement archives. He'd stolen the key from the janitor's closet earlier that morning. His hands trembled as he descended the creaking stairs, each step echoing like a death toll. The basement was a graveyard of forgotten paper. He dug through dozens of boxes until he found it, Faculty Records 1950 to 1960. Inside, buried beneath layers of dust and mold, was a thick envelope marked M.L. Margaret Linton. Files, reports, letters. Personal notes from former teachers. The more he read, the more disturbing the narrative became. Complaints about Margaret isolating students. Reports of nightmares spreading among the faculty. One letter ended abruptly mid-sentence, just before the writer could say what Margaret was preparing. The last paper was a black and white photo. Margaret, standing beside her class. Behind her, on the blackboard, a phrase scrawled in huge chalk letters. You cannot teach what you do not serve. He tried to stay away from the school. Called in sick. Locked himself in his flat. But the influence had already begun to take root inside him. Without realizing it, Adrian began sketching symbols on scraps of paper, walls, even his own arms. Geometric shapes, spirals, and ancient-looking glyphs, none of which he recognized. And yet, his hand moved with purpose, like it remembered. One morning, he awoke to find the entire mirror in his bathroom covered in these sigils, drawn backward, as if for someone looking from the other side. He tried scrubbing them off. But the mirror only cracked. From inside the reflection, he saw something move. A week later, Adrian returned to work, pale, haunted, different. During recess, one of his students, Lily Wren, vanished from the playground. One moment she was near the swings, the next, gone. No one saw her leave. No teacher had called her inside. There was no sign of struggle. Adrian reported it immediately. But what he found was worse than silence. Indifference. The principal said she must have gone home early. Her classmates didn't even remember her name. When Adrian called Lily's parents, the number had been disconnected. Her locker was empty, like it had never been assigned. Her seat in the classroom. Gone. There were only 20 desks now. Not 21. No one believed he had ever taught a girl named Lily Wren. But her name was still carved beneath one desk. Right beside the word. Margaret. The school's bell system had been out of order for years, replaced with digital tones. The old brass bell, once mounted above the entrance, had long since been decommissioned. But at exactly 3:03 a.m., the entire neighborhood heard it. Once. Then twice. Then 6 slow tolls. People claimed it was the wind, or some prank. But Adrian knew. He was standing at his window when it happened, watching the empty street below. And as the 6th bell rang, the lights in every home facing the school flickered off. His apartment filled with the scent of old chalk and mildew. And in the hallway mirror, he saw children walking past behind him, silent, barefoot, with hollow eyes. At the back of the procession was Margaret. Smiling. The next day, Adrian returned to room 6 alone, long after sunset. His hands moved with grim determination, as if led by instinct more than will. Beneath the teacher's desk, hidden in a cavity behind the old chalk tray, he found a leather-bound journal, aged, brittle, and stained with time. The handwriting inside was sharp and jagged, as if carved instead of written. It was Margaret's. The journal was not a diary. It was a guide. A manual for something ancient, something that used the structure of a school as a vessel for darker rites. It described each step of the curriculum, each student a vessel to awaken something called the headmistress beneath. But what chilled Adrian most was the inscription on the final page. To the one who reads this, you are the next to teach the lesson. His name was written below. In Margaret's handwriting. Something had followed him home. When Adrian opened the door to his flat, he stopped cold. His entire apartment had changed. The furniture was gone. The wallpaper peeled away, revealing the same faded green walls of room 6. Desks lined the floor in crooked rows. The windows were barred with rusted iron. The air smelled like wet wood and mold. And on the wall behind him, the chalkboard reappeared. Written on it, fresh and wet. Begin your lesson. He turned to flee, but the door was no longer a door, it was a bricked wall, dripping with black water. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. He wasn't even sure he was anywhere real. Without a sound, the room filled. The children were back. Not flesh and blood, but reflections of what they once were, transparent, cold, staring. Some were missing eyes, others dragged shadows behind them like smoke. Yet they all sat neatly, hands folded, awaiting instruction. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. Their eyes burned with expectation. And at the front of the class was an empty chair. Where Margaret once stood. Where Adrian now belonged. And the chalk rolled from the board tray to his feet. He tried to resist. But his body betrayed him. His hand reached for the chalk. His legs moved him to the board. And as his hand touched the cold surface, a voice slithered into his head, not loud, but deep, filled with static, like whispers from beneath a frozen lake. Teach them the truth, Adrian. Or they will teach it to you. His hand began to move against his will. Drawing circles. Symbols. Names. Writing words he didn't know. And every time he wrote a sentence, one of the ghostly children blinked, just once, and smiled a little wider. Until he wrote. I accept the lesson. And then everything went dark. Adrian awoke to the sound of birds. But they didn't sound right. He sat up and realized he was on the floor of room 6, sunlight pouring through the windows. But the desks looked new. The floors polished. The air smelled of chalk and fresh paper. Children filed into the room, laughing, real. Alive. One boy looked at him and smiled. Are you the new teacher? Adrian stumbled to his feet. He turned to the window and saw a newspaper left on the ledge. The headline read. October 13, 1956, St. Ethel's Academy welcomes new staff. He wasn't dreaming. He was back. And standing in the doorway was Margaret. But this time, she looked alive. She smiled, placed a hand on his shoulder, and whispered. Let's begin. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.